Here we are in a park next to a tree. It's obvious, isn't it? If you can guess where the tree is, I'll buy you lunch. You've got to guess exactly where the tree is. I'm sure you'll never guess. Now, sometimes you wake up in the morning and you think, oh, is that how it is? And I was going to do something else today, but I decided to change tack at the last moment because I've been thinking about this for a few days and all the pieces fell into place. Now, I am very, very aware of the process that goes into winning an election. And the Morrison-led Coalition government has an issue. It has a real problem. With the COVID-19 crisis economic meltdown, which will occur at the end of September, as the job seeker payment decreases and the job keeper payment will be restricted to a number of areas. The government's message that they are the economic managers for the next decade will fall flat on the population, because with increasing unemployment, increasing debt, as people have to pay back all that rent and mortgage repayments that were deferred, it's going to be very difficult for the government to run on a economic management platform. So what it needs to do is it needs to create an external threat, an existential threat to Australia and Australians. And this reminds me of the good old days in the 1960s and 70s when we talked about the Yellow Peril and the Reds Under the Bed campaign, which was launched successfully by the Menzies-led Liberal Country Party coalition for over 2 decades, and to allow them to win election after election after election, despite the economic conditions in the country at that particular point in time. So what Morrison-led government has done, Scotty from advertising has done, he's taken a leaf out of the Menzies book. Now, the thing about Australia is we've always had a funny attitude towards Asia. Although we're part of Asia, we are basically a European colonial outpost in the middle of nowhere, and we gain traction in this country by dispossessing in the most violent and evil fashion this country's people who had been living here for over 60,000 years. So we've always felt a little bit like a thief. We're always worried that somebody else is going to steal what we stole from somebody else. So it's a real issue. And in the 60s, the big thing was the Yellow Peril. And if you remember, those of you who are old enough to remember, the anti-Chinese sentiment and the anti-Asian sentiment in this country was palpable. It was so palpable that the first piece of legislation, which was passed by the federal government in 1901, when Federation occurred, was the White Australia policy. And so it was in this country's best interest to create fear of the outsider, create fear of what they described as the Yellow Peril, the invasion from the north, the communists and the Asians, especially the Chinese, overriding us. And it's quite interesting that in 2020, the Morrison-led Coalition government has taken a leaf out of that campaign. And that campaign is based, it's quite interesting, it's based on 2 concepts. Now, I move around a lot around the Australian community, so I'm pretty confident I know how a lot of Australians are thinking, the majority of Australians. And currently there is an anti-Chinese sentiment in this country, which to some degree has been fanned by the corporate-owned media. And that anti-Chinese sentiment is based on the concept of the COVID-19 crisis. And obviously, in the first few weeks when the virus exploded in Wuhan province, the local governor and the local authorities attempted to hide the problem from the central authorities, and the virus exploded not just through China but the rest of the world. And currently there are over 500,000 people who've died, and by the time people watch this video there'll be more than 500,000 people that have died from the COVID-19 crisis. So there's this general anti-Chinese sentiment in our community. This anti-Chinese sentiment in the community, as I said before, has been pushed and fanned by the corporate-owned media to a large degree. At the same time, we have a federal government that is desperate desperately looking for a ploy via which to win the next federal election in early 2022. And we saw over the last few days the raiding of the office of the New South Wales member of the Upper House, Mr. Moslemane. And it was quite interesting that although there were no allegations, no charges, the officers were raided by the federal police. The Labor Party hung him out to dry. The media said he was guilty, and the fact is what they're looking for supposedly is influence, Chinese influence in his office, people trying to influence him, which is now a crime, obviously, with the new legislation, this influencing. So you've got Mr. And what I find about the Australian Federal Police is quite interesting, is the upper echelons of the Australian Federal Police have now become fully politicised, and they are basically an arm of the government. Whether it's raids on reporters, whether it's a number of court cases which are going on now, it's quite obvious that whenever there's something going to happen, the Australian Federal Police have one of their little raids, as we saw with Mr. Moslemane, and the fact that there's an Eden-Monaro by-election in the next few days. And obviously the raiding of his office suits the government's current political agenda. So we've got this issue. So we've got a two-way tussle. We've got the dog whistling to the anti-Chinese sentiment in the community, because we can't, in these days of anti-racism or Black Lives Matter, I mean, being a racist isn't a very pleasant thing in Australian society, but you need to dog whistle to people who have got these racist sentiments. At the same time, you need to create a political ideology and a political program which is based on a fact which you can use to promote an anti-Chinese agenda, and that program is about the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I'm the last one to support the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, I'm the very last one. Obviously, it's an authoritarian regime which has done good things and bad things, but obviously more bad things than good things over its time. But I find it quite ironical that we have a government now is actually turning its attention, trying to make China an imminent threat to this country. We saw the Prime Minister announce all these extra defence measures on long-range missiles. We've seen United States troops triple in number over the last few years. We've seen the expansion of the Pine Gap military resources, United States military resources over the last few years. So we're seeing this cohesion between Australia's military forces and the United States military forces. So we've got this battle. We've got this Yellow Peril campaign, and the Yellow Peril campaign is, one, it's based on racism, and two, it's based on generating fear and panic in the community. Now, they talk about Chinese influence in Australian politics, Chinese influence in Australian universities, Chinese influence in the community, Chinese influence in the media, Chinese influence in the 1 million Chinese immigrants in this country, and we are told that we don't play this game. We have an agency called ASIS, which is basically a secret service agency to deal with external situations. We were involved in the invasion of Iraq, looking for weapons of mass destruction. We were involved in the Vietnam War. We were involved in the Middle East. We are now currently involved in situations around the country. We actually were bugging the wife of the last Indonesian president. The Bernard Kahiri case, which is going on in the Canberra Federal Court currently, is about Secret Service agents bugging the office of the new East Timorese government. Not because East Timorese was a threat to Australia, but because they wanted a commercial advantage. So we are involved in the very things that we're told the Chinese government is involved in. Now, all governments are involved in this type of activity. The Australian government is involved in this activity right up into its neck. It's involved in doing cyber attacks. It's involved in surveilling other governments, friendly governments and unfriendly governments. It's involved in black operations across the place. It's involved in this US military alliance. It's involved in all these things. So it's quite ludicrous. It's hypocritical to think. It's hypocritical to think that the Chinese involvement in this country's affairs is any different to our involvement. Look, I've seen no Chinese invasion of Australia, but I have seen Australia over the last century invade many places around the country because we've been asked to by the United States of America to protect their strategic and economic interests. So think about it. Think about it quite closely and clearly. Think about how we are being manipulated as a people, and we are manipulated not because the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people are an imminent threat to this country, but we are being manipulated in order to ensure that a specific ideology continues to reign supreme in this country, and that's corporate capitalism, private investment for private gain at the expense of ordinary people in this country. We are being manipulated to create panic and fear, to sow panic and fear in the community, panic and fear of the Yellow Peril once again being a dominant feature of this country's political rhetoric. And everywhere you look, you can see the ratcheting up of this anti-Chinese and anti-Chinese Communist Party rhetoric, not because of the direct threat, but because it is the only way that the Morrison-led coalition government believes it can be re-elected in 2022. It's re-elected by using racism, dog whistling the racist sentiments in our community, and it's going to be re-elected by creating fear in the community as a whole about the influence that the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state is having in this part of the world. Now, we need to understand that we are being manipulated. We need to look at what's happening. We need to understand about what's happening. We need to understand this is a strategy which is being pursued currently because of the current economic crisis. The government needs an external enemy, and that external enemy is China and the Chinese and Asians. We've gone back to the 1960s. The Yellow Peril is with us, whether it's 1901, 1960, 2020. If you can get a bit of political advantage by pushing fear, panic, misinformation in the community to be re-elected, that's what the government wishes to do. But today in 2020, hopefully we're a little bit more sophisticated than I was and we were in the 1960s and 1970s, and we can see right through this government's strategy, because ultimately what happens here depends on what happens here, not what happens overseas, but how we live, how we create wealth, how we distribute that wealth, how we look after people, how we live as a country. And our future is basically not directed by external threats, it's directed by what happens in this country today. And as I said before, we are the people we've been waiting for. I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interests. It's up to you. We're nearly there. We've needed about another 130 new members. Download the application form, pipsy.net. It's about time we had different ideas circulating in the community, not the same tired old rehashed ideas we had in 1901, we had in the 1960s and the 1970s. It's 2020, Australia for Australians.